Today's speaker is Erin Garrett. Erin is a natural resources, environment, and energy educator based in Southern Illinois. Erin, welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Eliana, and hello, everyone. I'm excited to be with you all today talking about grass identification. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, and I'm excited to be bringing this topic to the Everyday Environment webinar series. I've taught quite a few grass webinars before. I have a whole series called Witchgrass is Which. If you haven't checked it out, I'll share some links to where you can find that at the end today. But I'm excited that we're going to focus on annual grasses. So I wanted to say hello so you could put a face to a name, but I am going to turn my video off so that I don't block the pictures that I have in this PowerPoint. All right, so we'll get going here. And maybe one of the first things that we should start with is backing up and starting with what is a grass in general before we start talking about which one is which. Because a lot of the times we think that we see something that looks like a grass and there are other plants that are grass-like and that can get confused. So let's look at some characteristics that we can find in just the grasses in general. The first is that they belong to a group of plants called monocots. And these plants have quite a few characteristics, but there are a few that are easy to see on grasses. And the first is that they only have one cotyledon, which is the seed leaf or the first leaf that emerges when a grass starts to grow. If you compare this to something like a sunflower or a radish, I'm thinking of things that I've planted before in my garden and they start to grow, you see two leaves initially emerge from the ground. Grasses are different and they only have one. So hopefully you can see that in this picture here. This is a bunch of just little grass seedlings and they all have one individual blade when they first start to grow. Monocots also have parallel veins in their leaves. So you can see that all of the veins run next to one another. Okay, we don't have any veins that are netted or shaped like a feather. They're all parallel. Now, there are other plants that have those characteristics too, but those are things that grasses have. If we take it a little bit further, grasses don't have showy flowers. You know, when we consider flowers, most of the time we're thinking of big, beautiful blooms like a rose or a lily. I still find grass flowers beautiful, but it takes a special eye, I find, to appreciate more of the delicate, often overlooked beauty, like the grass flowers seen in this picture. This is from a grass called Oats grama, and it has beautiful red color when it's in bloom. But if you didn't know that, you might overlook it quite easily. Grasses also have sheathing leaves, and we'll look at this a lot more in depth, but essentially when we think of a leaf blade on a grass, that whole leaf actually will wrap around the stem and form a structure called a sheath. So it's a unique characteristic that grasses have and can help you tell them apart from other grass-like plants like sedges and rushes. And finally, grasses also have hollow jointed stems. Okay, so if you followed a leaf sheath all the way down to its base, there's a little swelling or a node. I like to think of it as like the kneecap of a grass, although they have multiple nodes along the stem. And that's another characteristic that can separate it from those grass-like plants, sedges and rushes. Okay, and then if you were to, you know, cut a grass stem, you'd find that it's hollow on the inside rather than full of pith or other spongy material. Okay, so that's how we tell what grasses are. Today, we're focusing on a specific group of grasses. We're looking at the annual grasses. So what does that mean? How do we tell them apart from other grasses? Well, an annual, in comparison to like a biennial or a perennial plant or grass in general, it's going to complete its entire life cycle in 1 year. So it will emerge, grow, flower, set seed, and then die all within an individual year. Okay. Within the annual grasses, we can break them into more specific groups based on the season in which they flower. So oftentimes you'll hear grasses referred to as a winter annual or a summer annual or spring annual, and that just coincides with their flowering timing. We also do that with other weeds in general. So you might have heard of, you know, your annual weeds, your winter annual weeds. And grasses fall into that same type of categorization. And then when it comes to these types of grasses, in general, most of them tend to grow in weedier or disturbed habitats. Although there are, of course, some high quality annual grasses that you can find when you're hiking in the woods or in the prairie. We'll look at some of those today, but most of the grasses we're going to look at are weedier species that you would find, maybe in your garden or in maybe like a prairie restoration or other disturbed, lower quality habitats. Before we focus on identifying different grasses today, it's important to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to the terms that we're using to identify grasses. Now, I know grass identification can be intimidating. I know it definitely was for me when I started. So I try to keep it pretty basic and keep the terms pretty approachable and things that are easy for you to see without needing a microscope, without needing a hand lens, and without needing to use a lot of technical terms. But to make sure we're all on the same page, we'll just go over some of these and look at some examples before we talk about the individual grasses. So here I have a sketch of a whole grass. This is just one example. Okay, if we look at the main stem of a grass is called a stem, but you may also see the term culm, C-U-L-M, used in reference to grasses. I like to just call it a stem. And along the stem, you will be able to find leaves, of course. And the leaves are made up of 3 parts. I kind of already started talking about these parts, but in general, what we think of as a leaf is called the blade. Okay. And then where that blade joins the stem, it's going to wrap around the stem and form that structure called a sheath. Okay. That one characteristic that differentiates grasses from other plants. Wherever that sheath ends, you're going to have that swelling or that node. Okay, so those 3 parts all comprise the leaf, the blade, the sheath, and the node. Okay. Another important place to look for identification characteristics is where that leaf blade joins the stem and becomes the sheath. We call that the collar region. So in the collar region, there are some other characteristics that we're going to look at shortly that are really helpful in telling grasses apart. And it's kind of a hidden spot. You might not think to look right in this area to help you with grass identification. You might be looking at, the flowering part of the grass at the top called the inflorescence. We're going to ignore that for right now. We'll come back to it in a few slides, but we're going to take a closer look inside this collar region and see what characteristics we can find there. Oops. The main thing that we are looking for is a structure called a ligule. Okay, ligules come in different shapes, sizes, and colors, and they are a great differentiating characteristic between the grasses. So in general, they come in 3 forms. We can have no ligule, so it's not even present. We can have a ligule that's made of hairs, we see in these 2 photos, or we can have something called a membranous ligule found in these 2 photos, in which we have a membrane-like structure that's usually white, but can be yellow, orange, or brown, and is kind of like a piece of skin that you'd find wrapped around the stem. Okay, most grasses have a ligule. It's either hairy or membranous. So if you find one like this one over here, where there's no ligule, you just find this smooth U-shaped raised surface. And it's actually a really great clue if you don't find a ligule and narrows down the grasses that you're looking at. Okay, but if you look a little bit closer, you can see we've got some short hairs here. We've got some long hairs, so there is variation within those types of ligules. And then again, a really short membranous ligule versus a really tall membranous ligule. Okay. The next thing that we're going to talk about is 2 other structures. One is called auricles, and the other is called horns. Okay, auricles are on the left, and I like to think of these as arms that hug the stem. Okay, so there are these structures colored in here that will extend from the top of the leaf sheath, and they wrap around and enclose the stem. It's really easy to see them when you pull this leaf blade back. because you'll see those arms kind of open up. But as it is right now in the pictures, it looks like they're kind of hugging the stem. It's a great characteristic if you're looking at a rye grass. A lot of the ryes have auricles, and of course there are other grasses that have that characteristic too. Another characteristic we can look at is something called horns. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I've only seen it in one grass, an Indian grass, and that's not an annual grass. So we're not even going to use that characteristic today. But basically what they are is it's this extra stiff U-shaped material that kind of juts up from the leaf sheath rather than wrapping around the stem like the auricles. So it's located here, but that's a good characteristic for Indian grass, which is a warm season perennial grass. Okay, we're going to get back to this inflorescence. That's the part at the top of the grass that I ignored earlier. So the inflorescence, that's just a term that we use for a collection of flowers on any plant that we're looking at. Okay, in grasses, we have a few different terms that we use to talk about the parts of an inflorescence. So when you get to the stem, we call it the rachis. Okay, I still sometimes call it the stem of the inflorescence. There's nothing wrong with that. The technical term is rachis, so if you see that, that's what it's referring to. And why do we need a specific term? Well, there's sometimes characteristics here that we look for, like hairiness. Sometimes the rachis can have hairs on it. Okay. Our grass flowering unit altogether is going to be called a spikelet. So everywhere where the flowers are going to develop, where the seeds are going to form, that whole unit we're going to call a spikelet. There are many, many parts of spikelets. There's lots of different terms that you could use to talk about the different parts of a spikelet. And for the most part, we're going to completely ignore all of that because we're trying to keep this approachable and user-friendly. So we're going to refer to those flowers as spikelets and just kind of describe them in general rather than looking at the individual parts and pieces. One of the main reasons we do that is because oftentimes you need a microscope to see all those individual pieces, and then it's just a lot of small, a little bit tedious work to kind of measure things in millimeters and not necessarily super field friendly. So we're going to keep it simple. We'll call it a spikelet. Sometimes spikelets can be held on little stalks. We can call those pedicels. That's the last term that's on this chart here. Okay. There are three main inflorescence types, and we can break them into three groups by asking ourselves a few simple questions. The first question that we would ask is if the rachis, or that stem of the inflorescence, if it branches, okay? And if we say yes, then we have something called a panicle, okay? I know it's a lot of terms. We will repeat them and go through them, and it'll start to make sense. So if our main stem of our inflorescence, our rachis, if it branches, we have a panicle. Okay, our spikelets can either be directly attached to those branches, or they can be held on those pedicels or those little stalks on those branches. Okay, in general, this is kind of the shape of a panicle, kind of open, airy, lots of branches. Okay, if our rachis or our stem did not branch, then we ask a second question, and the question is if the spikelets are held on stalks or not. Okay, pretty simple, right? I'll put all of this information up here. So if they are not held on stalks, they're called a spike. We'll go over here. A spike means you have just a central stem, no branches, and your spikelets are directly attached. Super simple, right? It looks like a spike. Okay. Everything else that's not a panicle and not a spike is a raceme. Okay. And there is still some debate on certain grasses if they're actually have a raceme or if it's more of a panicle. So if it's a little bit confusing and hard to tell apart, it still is for a lot of us in the grass ID world too. But in general, there's kind of two forms of racemes. Basically, this one here, you have your main stem and all of your spikelets are held on little stalks. Now, how can you tell it's a stalk and not a branch? Well, that's the question. A lot of the times it just comes down to relative length of that stalk or that pedicel. Okay, so if it's really short, we call it a raceme. If it's kind of long, we call it a panicle. But then you can get these other weird things where you have this giant collection of spikelets and they're all held together on a little stalk. This would be more like a crabgrass or a big blue stem. Okay, we call those racemes. So it's kind of a catch-all category that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, I find. But if I say it's not a panicle and it's not a spike, then we go with raceme. And again, we'll look at some examples. So what does all this look like? Here are two examples of panicles. So again, that's where we have a main stem and we have branches with spikelets on it. Okay, you can kind of see more of that open, airy look in our panicles. These are going to be racemes. So the two on the left, we've got those big long collections, finger-like collections of spikelets that are then held on little stalks or pedicels. And over here, we have individual spikelets right here, and they're held on little stalks, pedicels. Okay, and then one more. These are all going to be spikes. So in this case, all of our spikelets are directly attached to that main stem. And we call that a spike. Okay. I think I've got two more terms for you, and then we'll dive into individual grass identification. I said we were going to ignore most of the terms that refer to the parts of a spikelet, but there are two structures that we can look for. One of them is called awns, and the other is called bristles. So this one is an awn, and essentially they look like a bristle. They look like some wire structure, right, that is attached to our spikelets. And the important way to tell them apart is awns are attached at the outer point or the outer tip of that spikelet. Okay, they can come in different shapes, sizes, and colors. Again, my sketch kind of shows a few different ways they could be arranged. Spikelets can have more than one awn. They can have 2 awns or 3 awns. Awns can be, you know, 1/8 of an inch long. They can be 6 inches long. They can vary greatly in size. And then this one over here that's twisted is this one right here. This is from a porcupine grass. Really cool awn that twists as it dries, and it helps drill that seed down into the soil. Very cool adaptation. If you have something that looks like an awn, but all of the pieces are attached at the base of the spikelet rather than the tip, it's called a bristle. Okay, bristles are super common in foxtails. We'll look at 3 different foxtail grasses today. So in this case, if you broke off a piece of them, you'd see that all the bristles are attached to the base of the spikelet rather than emerging from the tip. Okay, so we call that a bristle. Okay, those are our terms that we're going to use to point out the different characteristics of the grasses. So we're going to move into looking at how to identify specific individual grasses. Again, these are all annual grasses that are found in Illinois that you should be able to see depending on where you're at in the state. And I think I have about 20 grasses that we're going to look through. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first one we're going to look at is a grass called Prairie Three-Awn. And this is an example of a grass that has a really great common name that describes it really well. That doesn't happen often, but this one is definitely one of those. So this grass is one of 10 different species in this genus, this Aristida in Illinois. And it is a summer annual, and it's a native. So I talked about how most of these are non-native grasses, but this one is from Illinois. It grows in drier areas like prairies, glades, other pastures, and railroads. And you can see it's pretty well distributed throughout the state, nearly every county in Illinois. It's a super hard grass to take pictures of, but because it's very thin in size, very thin, delicate. If you saw it in person, because I can't find it in the pictures, it does have red nodes along the stems. So if your stem is green and it has a red node on it, that would stand out a little bit. It is one of those grasses that doesn't have a ligule, so there's no structure to look for where that leaf blade joins the stem. And then the inflorescence would be described as a raceme. And in this case, each of the spikelets has 3 very long awns. And they bend when they mature. So here you can see this is an individual spikelet, and I tried to space out those 3 awns so you can see how long they are. They're kind of red in color, but as the grass dries, as it matures, these awns would kind of bend in half and kind of be at a right angle to one another. Okay, it takes on a different look than for the Prairie Three-Awn. But this would be one, I found it in like higher quality glade habitats. So that drier kind of exposed limestone prairie habitats where I've seen this one before. Okay. Next, we have Barnyard Grass, Echinocloa mercata. This grass is, again, super widespread in Illinois, so it's highly likely that you could find some close to where you are. It is another native grass, and it prefers wet, disturbed areas. So around a pond, in more low-lying areas, this is a grass that really does well. It is another grass that doesn't have a ligule. This is the example I showed earlier. So here, there's no membrane, there's no hairs, it's just a smooth surface. And it also has a prominent midrib or vein on the leaves. I didn't include just an individual picture of the leaf, but you can kind of see right here that there is a vein that is super prominent. It's kind of clear in color, but you can definitely see that difference between the green leaf blade. And then this grass has a panicle inflorescence, okay? So again, remember that shape of that open, airy panicle. In this case, we've got all our spikelets directly attached to those branches. And this grass is kind of interesting because there are several different varieties. So within one species, there's several different varieties, and some of the spikelets have awns, like we can see in this picture here, and some of them don't have awns, like in this one over here. So it can come in both forms, it's the same species, just a different variety or different subspecies. Okay. The next two that we're going to look at are both in the same genus. They're both related to one another in the Panicum. This first one is fall Panicum, and don't let the name confuse you because it's a summer annual, so it will bloom in late summer. It's another native grass, but it likes more disturbed prairies, savannas, or fields. You know, I found this one in like in a prairie restoration, in an old ag field that was being restored. This one, its leaves are kind of spreading and floppy. I know that's not a great word to use, but you can kind of see in this picture, they're not held up right or out. They kind of just fold over or flop over. They can have hairs on the leaves. You can kind of see some hairs at the base of the leaf blade here. But an important thing to tell it apart from the next grass we're going to look at is that the leaf sheaths, the part that wrap around the stem, are hairless. There aren't any hairs there. So you might find hairs on the blades, but you won't find them on the sheath. This is a grass with a ligule, and it's a white hairy ligule. And you can find that right here. Now you'll see there are other hairs here. Those are just hairs on the leaf blade. That's not part of the ligule. This right here is that ligule structure. And then in this grass, it has a very large open airy panicle. Okay, so this can be, you know, up to a foot tall, can be about 6 to 8 inches wide. So that's kind of the size scale that we're looking at. But you see there's tons of branches and the spikelets are really small. So it gives you that kind of really open, airy look. And then this grass can get up to 4 feet tall. So size-wise, this one can get pretty tall. So keep this one in your mind. And I'm going to switch to the next slide. And we're going to look at witchgrass. I can't do a Witchgrass's Witch webinar without talking about witchgrass. It's my favorite one to throw in there. So this one is related to that fall panicum that we just looked at, but the whole plant is going to be much smaller. So in general, you know, 1 to 2 feet. It can get up to 3 feet. And the panicle of this grass is usually at least 1 foot to 1.5 feet tall. So more than half the height of the grass is taken up by its panicle, rather than the last grass that could get 4 feet tall, and only 1/4 of that would be the panicle. Okay, so a little bit different there. This is a native summer annual, just like the last one, finding it in really similar areas like disturbed areas, fields, and even some glades. On this one, the leaf blades can be hairy, like we see in the center photo, but usually the sheaths are always hairy. So that's going to be that comparison between this one and the last one. We have tons of these hairs on this witchgrass. It's a super hairy plant. And it does have a short hairy ligule as well. You can see that in this picture right here. Okay, and then like I mentioned before, a very large open airy panicle, and then that rachis, or that main stem of the panicle, is going to have hairs on it as well. So witchgrass, just lots of hairs, very hairy, often short, and then that really big panicle. You can see it in this photo too, that the spikelets are kind of pinkish or purple in color. That can happen. That coloring can be variable. Okay, we're going to move into the love grasses. The love grasses, there are about 15 different species in Illinois. We're going to look at 3. Okay, we're going to try to tell them apart from one another. The first one is tufted lovegrass. Okay, tufted lovegrass. This can be found in every county in Illinois. And believe it or not, I have never had my camera with me when I've seen it. So I don't even have my own images. I had to find some to use to show you. But this one is a native summer annual. You find it in drier prairies and disturbed habitats. And it is a sprawling bunch grass. Okay, so it's going to grow in a bunch, and then those stems are going to kind of sprawl down towards the ground. Okay, this one you can find long white hairs in these tufts where the leaf blade joins the stem. That's characteristic just in general of the love grasses. So that kind of helps them stand out from others, but isn't really helpful when you're trying to tell them apart from one another. In this case, we're going to look just in general at kind of the size, and then the way that the spikelets are arranged in the panicle. So this one has a narrow panicle for its inflorescence, right? We don't have really big branches like in that witchgrass. It's kind of all small and tight and contracted. And then our spikelets are going to be kind of elongated and flattened. Okay, so that's our tufted lovegrass. We're going to look at our creeping lovegrass next. This is again a native summer annual, but it likes wet, disturbed habitats. So different habitat type. The last one liked those drier habitats, more glade areas. This one likes wetter habitats. So that's your first way to tell them apart. It is also a bunch grass, but it stays a lot shorter. So generally closer to the ground, like you see in this picture right here, you can see it's, less than 6 inches tall, and is already flowering. You'll find that same tuft of white hairs, really hard to see, but it is there. And then it's going to have a panicle again, but in this case, you see that these spikelets themselves are a lot longer, and there's a lot fewer of them held together in their panicle. So that's creeping lovegrass. Okay, it creeps, it forms those mats over time. And then the third one that we're going to look at is our first non-native summer annual, so one of our less desirable species, and this is called stinkgrass. Okay, another one that I love the name because it's accurate and it's going to help you remember how to identify this one. So this one you'll find on roadsides, in your gardens, in your pastures. Really cool identification on this one is something that you'll find on the margin or the edge of the leaf blade. And you can see in this image right here, if you look at the edge of the leaf blade, you see all these little drops right here. Those are all glands that will have these little drops on them. I can't remember if they're sticky or not if you touch them, but really interesting characteristic that kind of stands out from all the other grasses that we've looked at and that we will look at today, okay, is those little droplets on the edge of the leaf blade. It has a hairy ligule, but also that tuft of hairs that we can see pretty prominently here. And then the leaves have a really unpleasant odor if you crush them or if you mow them, right? If you break that leaf, you're going to have an unpleasant odor. So hence the name stinkgrass. Okay. Again, we're going to have a panicle of more flattened spikelets, but in this case, they're a little bit, they're not as skinny and long. They're a little bit more, oval shaped. That's the word I'm looking for, oval shaped and a little bit flattened. So that's going to be your stinkgrass, going to grow in a different habitat again, much more disturbed areas. And then if you add in, those glands along those leaf blades and that unpleasant odor, I think you're going to get to stinkgrass pretty easily. Okay, moving away from the love grasses, the next one we're going to see is little barley. Little barley is one of 5 species in the Hordeum genus. And this grass grows up to 1.5 feet tall, so it's a little bit shorter. And it is categorized as either a winter or a spring annual. Just kind of depends on the weather that we're having, if it's able to start growing in the late fall, early winter, or if it has to wait until spring to really start to green up. You'll find it in prairies and disturbed areas, and it is a bunch grass. So you'll see a bunch right here together. This grass has really short leaf blades that are rather broad. You know, if you compare this to like a Kentucky bluegrass, which is really thin leaf blades, or that Three-Awn that we looked at, more of a broad leaf and pretty short in size with a pointed tip. And then the inflorescence is going to be a spike. And in this case, we have a spike with densely packed with spikelets, and each of those spikelets has awns on them. So this one in general, if you're familiar with barley, it looks somewhat like barley, right? Grows shorter in size and has that spike that makes it super easy to identify. Little barley. Okay, we're going to look at two brome grasses next. Bromes in general, most of the ones that we have in Illinois are non-native species, and that's going to be the case for the two that we're going to look at today. There are about 20 to 21 species of brome grasses in Illinois. This one is called common chess. And I will just say, for common names in general, especially with the grasses, every grass doesn't have a specific individual common name. A lot of them are just called like brome grass, for example, or there's multiple that are called chess. So really in differentiating grasses, if it's important for you to get it down to species, being familiar with those Latin names that are listed below, those scientific names, is really helpful in just communicating and sharing what grass that you are looking at. So one of the common names for this one is common chess, but there are other grasses with that same name. So non-native, summer annual. You can find it in disturbed areas, fields, but also some glade habitats. The leaves and the sheaths of this grass, they can be hairy or smooth, and I didn't include any pictures of those up close because it's so variable. And the inflorescence, right, is the most important characteristic for this grass. It is a panicle, and it often droops to one side. You can kind of see the drooping happen in this image on the left, where you have all of those branches that are held off to one side, and then your spikelets attached. The spikelets are pretty long and a little bit flattened, and then they have multiple awns on them as well. Something that happens in the brome grasses too is you'll see that all those parts of the spikelets are kind of all compressed together on the left picture, but on the right, as they dry, they kind of open up and get more of a V shape to those spikelets. Okay, so that's common chess. The next one is called cheatgrass, but another name that I hear a lot of people use for it is downy brome. Okay, so downy brome or cheatgrass, or using that scientific name, Bromus tectorum. Okay, this is a non-native winter annual found in fields, pastures, landfills, and roadsides. And this grass, I first learned about it when I was working for the Nature Conservancy, because we were managing this grass and prairie restorations. Since it is an annual grass, it can put out a lot of vegetation each year, and it's actually changing the fire regimes more out west in some of the grasslands, because it produces so much fuel, right, for fire to spread. And then it's also not great to have around if you have grazers, because if you look at all of these awns right here, that doesn't look really pleasant to eat and get stuck in your throat. So definitely a problem grass. Some states treat it as an invasive species, so something to pay attention to. This one, it has leaves and sheaths that are very hairy, and they're really short hairs, so it's more of like a velvety feel to the grass. So you can kind of see they're kind of sparkling in the sunlight in this picture, all of those hairs, but not like those long hairs that we saw in that witchgrass, right, that were really, really visible. You'd be able to feel these if you run your hand on the leaf blade. And then it has this really characteristic drooping inflorescence, a very strongly drooping rachis or stem of that inflorescence that you see right here. This one we would call a panicle, And then each of those spikelets is super hairy too. You can see all the hairs that are glistening on those spikelets. And then they have these long awns on them that spread as the spikelets dry out. I should have put these pictures next to one another. You can see that all of the awns are facing straight down. And then on the right, when that grass dries out, you'll see that they really spread apart and form that V shape. Super characteristic for cheatgrass. In general, if I see really widely spreading awns like that and a drooping panicle, I'm like, that's cheatgrass. I know it right away. Okay. And this one you can see in the background. This is in a garden setting where I took this picture. This grass is completely senesced or dead, and it's in the late spring, early summer. Everything else is green behind it. So looking at when it's growing, it's a winter annual, so it starts to grow its leaves in the winter, it overwinters, and then it really starts to green up very, very early in the spring. And then I didn't have on here, it also has a hairy ligule. Okay, cheatgrass, you can find it in every county in Illinois. If you find it, I would pull it out. Okay, next one is oats. You've probably seen this grass before. It's another non-native spring annual, and you'll find it in disturbed areas, fields, and in cover crop seed mixes, or in any place where they've done recent construction. This grass is oftentimes included in that seed mix because it will only persist for a year or two just from the seed bank, and then it kind of dies out pretty well. The leaves and the stems of this grass have a characteristic that's super interesting. We call it glaucous, and this basically means that the foliage has a white bloom or a white coating on it that kind of looks and acts like a sunscreen. So imagine that you sprayed sunscreen on a grass and have this white coating on it that you could rub off with your finger. I don't have a good picture of it to show you, but this grass does exhibit that characteristic, and it's pretty helpful in identifying different grasses. It has a super tall membranous ligule that you can see in this picture right here, like very easy to see, very prominent, definitely stands out. And then it makes a panicle inflorescence right here where we have these branches, and then we have our spikelets, and then they're kind of puffy or inflated. Okay. And then they will split apart again to form a V shape, kind of like the cheatgrass and the brome that we were looking at. But they don't have those long awns, right, that we see in that grass. And we find this growing in a little bit of a different habitat too. Okay, oats. This one can get I've seen around 3 feet tall. Okay, for those that were here to identify the things that were growing in your lawn, crabgrasses are annual plants that fall into that category. There are actually quite a few different types of crabgrasses. I don't know that it really matters being able to tell them apart from one another if they're growing in your lawn, but we'll look at 2 different ones. The first one is typically called common crabgrass, but I like to call it hairy crabgrass because the other one we're going to look at is called smooth crabgrass. And I can't remember the difference between common and smooth, but I can remember hairy and smooth. So this one is, again, a summer annual, non-native. We find it all over the place in disturbed areas, in our lawns. I know it's in my lawn, so don't feel bad if it's in yours too. And one way we can tell it apart is that it has these hairy leaf sheaths. So again, the leaves in general can have variable hairiness. There can be some hairs at the base of the leaf blade, but definitely that sheath is going to have hairs on it. And then it's going to make a raceme inflorescence. This is going to be that weird one where it's a finger-like collection of spikelets all held on a stalk. And they kind of have these paired, they're a little offset in this picture, but these paired spikelets that are held on this little flattened stalk or pedicel. Okay. And then the spikelet size is going to be a little bit different between these 2 species. So I did put that on there, although I'm not expecting anyone to go out with a ruler to use that as a characteristic. Really, you're going to want to look for if there's hairs on this leaf sheath. That's kind of the biggest telltale if you have a grass that looks kind of like this. Okay, hairy crabgrass, every county in Illinois. Smooth crabgrass apparently has not been reported in every county in Illinois, but I don't know if I believe that because I feel like it's everywhere. So again, Basically, all of the characteristics on this slide are going to be the same as the last grass, except that the leaf sheaths are going to be hairless. So kind of hard to tell in the pictures again that I took here, but right here on the leaf sheath, you can see there aren't any hairs here. There's some at the base of the leaf blade, but not any on that sheath. Okay, and then this one, the spikelets are going to be a whole millimeter smaller. So again, very, very specific characteristic. I wouldn't use that as my go-to. I'd look at the hairiness of the leaf sheaths. All right, next one is annual bluegrass. Annual bluegrass is super easy to spot, especially early in the year. To call this a spring or a fall annual. We haven't really looked at any other fall annuals, but I guess you could categorize it as a late fall, early winter annual. This one will start to green up again before the cold winter temperatures set in, so that it is ready to go right when it starts to warm up in the spring. I took these pictures on March 1st. Now, again, I'm in far southern Illinois, but I took these pictures on March 1st when we were weeding out some raised garden beds, and it was super easy to identify this grass because it grows in these tight little bunches, and it was already blooming. You can see those panicles already fully developed. It does have a membranous ligule, and another characteristic that you find in the bluegrasses in general is that they have something called a boat-shaped leaf tip. So if you picture in your head the front of a kayak or a canoe and how it has that tapered point, you can see that same shape here at the tip of the bluegrass. So you'll find that in Kentucky bluegrass, in Canada bluegrass, annual bluegrass, all of the something like 18 species of bluegrasses that we have in Illinois. But this one in general, you can see this is my hand. You can see how short it is. So like under 6 inches tall in a tight bunch, growing in a disturbed area, in a cultivated area. And then you see this panicle. If you're familiar, if you have a Kentucky bluegrass lawn and you've let it grow a little bit longer than you should have between mowing, you know that it will flower and make this really, this is just kind of a bluegrass panicle inflorescence that's pretty general. Okay, annual bluegrass. Next up is goose grass. This is another one that I couldn't believe I didn't have any pictures of. Another weedy one that you're probably super familiar with and that you've seen in your lawn or in other disturbed areas. So goose grass is going to be a bunch grass. It has a flattened stem. I didn't talk about this earlier, but most grass stems are round. Some of them can be a little bit flattened though. So this one here, you can kind of see that it's not round, it's kind of squished. So it has a flattened stem and kind of, because of that characteristic, it has another characteristic that we call a keeled leaf. So a keeled leaf in general means that it looks like we took that leaf and we folded it in half like a piece of paper and it retains that crease. So think about folding a piece of paper in half. It has a crease or a fold in the center. This leaf sheath has that crease as well. Okay, and in this grass, you can find long hairs on the edge of the leaf blade. Ooh, my pointer will work. You can see those right here. And it has a white membranous ligule that you can see right here as well. This is another one that's going to have a raceme inflorescence with finger-like collections of spikelets that are kind of arranged in a whorl, so all together at one point. Okay, just like the crabgrass, right? It looks very similar, but we're going to have a different, we're going to have a flattened stem, we're going to have a keeled leaf sheath, and we are going to be a little bit, the leaf blades are going to be a little bit wider. It's going to look a little bit different than that crabgrass. Okay, moving on to the foxtails. There are several different foxtails that we can find. I think I'm going to look at 2 of them today. Giant foxtail is up first. It's another non-native, and it's another summer annual. You'll find it in a disturbed low quality area, so like our prairie restorations, old fields that have been abandoned along our roadsides, you know, along railroad tracks, in your front yard, in that strip of property between your home landscape and the street, where it's usually a bunch of weeds growing. That's where you'd find giant foxtail. This one can have short, small, like stiff hairs on the leaf blades, and then its ligule is also made up of stiff hairs. Okay, the inflorescence in general is going to be a spike, but it's going to curve downward. Okay, so that curving downward is important to distinguish it from other foxtails. And then the spikelets are small and round, and they are surrounded by 1 to 3 bristles individually. So you can see all of those bristles held together. But if you were to just pinch off a section of those spikelets, hold them in your hand and look at an individual spikelet, you could count that there are 1 to 3 bristles around each spikelet. Okay, we tell the foxtails apart by the size of the grass, if the spike curves or if it's held straight up, and how many bristles are around the spikelets. Okay, so giant foxtail curves, 1 to 3 bristles. It also is larger in size, so it can get about 4 feet tall. The next one is yellow foxtail. Yellow foxtail typically stays under 3 feet tall. Find it in similar areas. It blooms at the same time. It has a hairy ligule. It can have some long hairs in the collar region here towards the base of the leaf. But if you plucked off a spikelet with its bristles around it, you'd find that there are 5 to 15 bristles around that individual spikelet. Okay, our last one is green foxtail. Green foxtail, same characteristics, has a smooth leaf blade though, a ligule of short white hairs, and each of those individual spikelets are surrounded by 1 to 3 bristles. So in this case, I didn't put it on here, but the spike usually stays straight up. It doesn't bend over like the giant foxtail. It's a little bit shorter, so usually under 2 feet tall for green foxtail. Okay, and then it's got 1 to 3 bristles under each of its spikelets. Okay, so those are a few ways to tell those 3 apart. I didn't mention color. So I didn't say anything about yellow foxtail is yellow, green foxtail is green, because if I look at this in general, yeah, it looks yellow. But if I look at it up close, well, hold on, the spikelets are green. The bristles are kind of orange. And then if I go here, it's green, but you might say that some of these look kind of yellow. And when this one blooms, it has a little bit of purple on it. So in general, I don't go by color for these because there are much more reliable characteristics that do tell them apart. Okay, last grass. We're almost there. I know it's a lot, it's overwhelming, but I had to put this one in here. Japanese Stiltgrass, Microcegium femininum. This is a non-native, but I elevated that to invasive. We do manage this as an invasive species in Illinois. It's a summer annual. It's a really interesting grass that has a really long growth period. So it starts to grow really early in the spring, but it doesn't actually flower until the fall. So we do call it more of a summer annual. You can find this in the woods and floodplain forests, along roadsides. I know it's in the ditch near my house. So it's getting very close. It's not just restricted to, and I live in town. It's not just in the woods. But this one has these kind of short, broader leaves that are a little bit curved, and they have a prominent silvery midrib or mid-vein that's kind of off center. So we can see that really great in this picture. This is kind of a silvery vein. It's not quite in the middle. And it kind of stands out if you look at this big bunch of it over on the right. It has a slightly hairy stem, and then it does produce this spike-like raceme inflorescence. And I say spike-like because I went a few years thinking that it had a spike before I actually found it when it was fully mature and the branches open to the side. So it can fool you, but here we've got those kind of finger-like collections of spikelets that we've talked about that characterize the raceme. And you can see that it's spreading. It wouldn't surprise me if it was in a lot more counties than I have on this map right here. This is just what I had reported from when I pulled this map, and I don't know that I've updated this one in the last year or two. So definitely one to watch out for. It's an invasive species that's an annual. So in general, if you could pull it out of the ground, right, and get it out of the ground before it seeds, you could work on stopping that spread. The seeds do last about, I want to say, at least 5 years in the soil. I know there are some seed studies going on right now. So definitely not something you want to get established, because you might be working for 5 or 6 years to eradicate that, if not more. But really important one that I wanted to make sure I included, since it is definitely spreading throughout the state, so that we can be familiar with what that one looks like. Okay, now that I've stuffed so many different grasses into your brain, we're going to review for a second. If you have no idea where to start, right? The easiest place to start is if you have an inflorescence. So if the grass is flowering, definitely start there. Break it down. What type of inflorescence? Is it branched? Then it's a panicle. If it's not, are the spikelets directly attached to the stem? Then it's a spike. And if not, it's a raceme. Are there awns or bristles? What size are they? How many are attached to the spikelets, right? Those are really good questions to ask. If you don't have an inflorescence, you can use leaf characteristics, although it is much harder to identify a grass if it is just in its vegetative form. Okay, it's not impossible, but it's a lot harder. You can definitely look for that ligule. Is it hairy membranous? Is it absent? You can look and see if there are auricles, those arms. You notice none of the grasses that we talked about today, none of the annual grasses we looked at had auricles, but it might separate out some other ones. And then look for hairs. We talked about hairs a lot on leaf blades, on leaf sheaths, in the collar region, hairy ligules, all of those things. So those are all super helpful characteristics to look for. So you can kind of jot down a few of those characteristics and then try to figure out what that grass is. Now, how are you going to do that? What resources do I recommend? There are a couple places that are my go-tos just in general for plant identification, but definitely with grass identification. I use Illinois Wildflowers website all of the time. There is also an app version that I have not used, but others have told me that they have used the app version. I use just the online version. And then the grass ID book that I use is called Grasses, Sedges, and Rushes, an Identification Guide by Lauren Brown and Ted Elliman. And this was just recently updated. So Lauren Brown had a version out in, I think like 1979. And in about 2020, she put out a new version with Ted and added in a lot more pictures. The original version just had sketches. Sketches are great for grass ID, but pictures are super helpful. And then it does also have some sedges and rushes. So that's my go-to for resources. But you'll say that's not really a lot of choices. So I have been working on compiling a whole bunch of different resources as well, available through Illinois Extension. So Eliana is going to drop a link in the chat to our grass webpage in general. And on there, you can find a whole bunch of different resources. So we are creating just a website in general. That's the link that Eliana put in there. But I am also writing a blog. When I have time, it gets a little bit hard in the summertime to get those blog posts up. I'm a little bit behind, but I do have a grass blog. You can subscribe to that. I will not email you more than twice a month with updates on how to identify individual grasses and just other tips and tricks. I do have a short video series as well on how to identify about 25, I think, different species in Illinois. They are 1 to 2 minute videos individually. So if you really want to identify big blue stem, for example, you can watch a 2-minute video that has footage of me showing you how to identify that grass. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to see it in video form than just the pictures that I used today. And then, of course, the 5 or 6 other webinars that I have in the Witchgrass is Witch webinar series. I have a cool season, a warm season grass, and then I have 3 that are broken out by habitat. So prairie grasses, a woodland grasses, and then a nuisance grass in general. There are some repeats among all of those webinars, but those are all available. And you can find all of that information just by that link that Eliana put in there. So those are some places that you can learn more. As we wrap up today, I do want to mention that our next Everyday Environment is coming up in August. Wow, it's already going to be August. And it's about being prepared for a storm. So I know many of us have probably experienced some crazy storms this summer. I know I have. And it seems like they are always ready to just pop up. And I don't know that I'm always ready. So I'm definitely going to sign up for this one. And Eliana is going to put that registration link in the chat box for you as well. And then finally, I do want to, of course, thank you all for being here with me today. I do have an evaluation if you want to leave some feedback. We've got a QR code you can scan. We've got a short URL, and we will follow up with an email with that link too, if you just want to wait for me to send it to you to complete that. And I do also have a copy of the slides as a handout. I wasn't able to finish it in time before the webinar. I know it's super helpful to have ahead of time, but I will be sending that out after the fact, so you do have a reference moving forward. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. I know I ran a little bit long, but Eliana, if there are some questions, I can stay on for a few minutes and see what we can answer.
There are some really great questions in the chat here. So I'm going to go, some I think may have been answered throughout when you got to that portion. So I'm going to go latest first. Why does the largest county, McLean, why is that lacking in so many grasses? Is it just not documented?
Oh, that's a great question. So a lot of the maps that I took, they're from the plants database. And my impression of that database is that it's historical data. So it might not necessarily be the most accurate. If you noticed with that last grass, that Stiltgrass, it was kind of a different map. I pulled that from a different website that is tracking invasive species spreads. So it just might be that that was one of the counties that wasn't just super documented historically. So I'm sure that you have a lot of grasses. There's a lot of grasses there. It's just not documented.
Okay, let's see. Is Stiltgrass present in Logan County? I know that that was one that didn't have as many, maybe that not that one may not have been documented there yet.
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head. The resource that I used is called EdMaps. I'll put that in the chat. You can go to, if you just type that in, the website will pop up and you can type in the species and then look at the current map. A lot of these maps I've pulled in the last year or two, so that's not the most up-to-date information.
Okay. And now, which annual grasses, if any, work well for soil reclamation or restoration?
Oh, that's a good question. The one that I see used a lot in more restoration efforts is that the Barnyard Grass, which was way at the beginning. And a lot of the times I see that planted for like wildlife food and cover. So a lot of waterfowl will eat the seeds. Just other ones in general, I don't know off the top of my head because a lot of them were non-native. And honestly, since they're annual grasses, not necessarily like a long-term solution, right? That oats is planted a lot, you know, after like construction work has been done or work has been done to kind of provide that initial cover, right? It's put in a lot of seed mixes to provide something so that the soil doesn't just wash away and it holds it in place. But those would kind of be the two that I would say.
These are great questions. Here's another good one, a really great question. How did all these non-native grasses get introduced to Illinois?
That is a great question. So we've moved a lot of things around, right? A lot of the non-native plants just in general, right, were brought over for some purpose or accidentally transported. So, you know, a lot of our non-natives were brought over for, you know, to help reverse our soil erosion. That's the word I'm looking for, or to be planted as forage, right? A lot of our cool season grasses that we plant in the spring are pasture grasses that our livestock eat. So they're intentionally introduced, right? And then a lot of the times they stay where we plant them, but sometimes they can spread and then become a problem, right? And depending on how big of a problem it gets and what the impacts are, then we could, you know, treat them as invasive, right? But a lot of the times we did move them in intentionally for some initial purpose. Sometimes that purpose works, sometimes it doesn't. But then also, you know, plants can come over accidentally. So that Stiltgrass, well, Stiltgrass was used as a packing material for porcelain. and then some seeds got out and it established. So not necessarily, it wasn't intentional, right? That was an accident. And then seeds can be, seeds are in the soil. There's always something there. And so things can be transported, across states, overseas, and shipping other plant material that we did want, right? So there's a lot of different ways that they've moved around. And then they kind of pop up in more of these disturbed habitats that don't have that good quality, ecosystem and vegetation established that can kind of buffer that a little bit more.
We are at 2 o'clock, but there are maybe about 3 more questions. Erin, what are your feelings on that?
I can stay on for a few more minutes. That's fine.
Okay, great. So one question is, what does it mean by disturbed area? Kathleen in the chat did answer it, which I think was a good answer. I'll read it, and then Erin, maybe if you have anything you want to add to it, okay, that would be great. So disturbed area is ground that has been recently disturbed, dug, etc. Some plants are especially good at taking advantage of soil that has been newly exposed.
Yeah, that's definitely. I agree with that. We also use, besides just recent disturbance, just some of those sites in general, I can think about that had past disturbance, right? So if you think about a lawn or like a new subdivision that's been built, right? There's definitely a lot of soil disturbance that goes on in those areas. And then we consider that disturbed soil for the next, few decades for sure, because it's been so greatly changed and altered, right? So it is definitely recently disturbed areas, but it can also be areas that have that legacy of big disturbance, right? But yeah, definitely that would be our disturbed areas.
Will we be going over weedy, undesirable grasses? That was early. That was I heard about 1:30 when that question, and I believe
we got there. Yes.
We did.
We were starting with the good ones first. Then we got that.
And then is height an identifying characteristic? I believe you mentioned it a couple of times, but maybe I don't know if you'd like to speak more about that.
I did start throwing height in a little bit. That's helpful, as a beginner, and not specific heights, right? But height in general. Like if it's going to be under a foot tall, that's definitely different than something that's 4 foot tall. That's definitely something that's different. That's 8 foot tall. We didn't talk about any of those grasses because most of them aren't annual, because that's a lot of growth that they'd have to put out when they also have to flower in that year. So in general, height can be super helpful, but I wouldn't, like, if I say a grass can get up to 3 feet tall and you see it and it's 4 feet tall, I wouldn't completely rule it out, right? It's just kind of a general scale that we can use. But for sure, definitely, I look at, height as a helpful tool.
Great. We have one last question here. Can you talk about cover crop annual grasses or give a resource?
Oh, that's a great question. I would look and see what NRCS has listed as cover crops and see what annual grasses are in there. That oats is the only one that really comes to mind. There are a few others in the back of my brain and they're just not coming to the forefront right now. But there are definitely resources out there, and I would look up what NRCS has listed.
Great. Well, we have come to the end of our questions. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to today's webinar, and thank you, Erin, for this great plethora of wonderful information. I absolutely learned a lot today. So thank you, Erin, and thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar.
Thanks, Eliana. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.